Hello, welcome to Post-Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and this is the second session in our ongoing course on post-colonialism. In the previous session, if you recall, we had discussed kind of a general discussion of post-colonialism itself as a field of study or as a concept as offered by Robert Young. Now, of course, the link to that edited version is available on the course website as well as on the playlist for this course on the channel. And today we will be talking about Arif Dirlik's essay, The Postcolonial Aura, Third World Criticism in the Age of Global Capitalism, which is a really interesting critique of postcolonialism. Now, please keep in mind that there are two other essays that we'll be reading, Ella Shohat and Anne McClintock. Those precede this essay, but I've put this one first because I thought it's interesting to see Arif Dirlik's argument. And so our plan is the next two sessions we'll dedicate one to Anne McClintock and the other to, of course, Ella Shohat. And overall, these three articles kind of give you some general critiques of the field of postcolonialism as it is emerging. Now, see, this article came out in 1994. Ella Shohat and Anne McClintock's articles were published in 1992 because Social Text had done two special issues on postcolonialism, issue 30 and 31. So these are the early critiques of postcolonialism as it is getting established within the American Academy. And it's crucial as a postcolonialist for you to know where the critiques come from and, why do they matter, why it is important to know that. Now, as someone who teaches postcolonial studies and who still believes in so much of what it does, I know already that the field itself or the subfield of English departments have come far from where it was, where Arif Dirlik is critiquing it. So please keep that in mind. And thank you so much for joining me. I'm seeing quite a few people. So Anum, thank you for joining us. Chandra Prakash, thank you so much for joining us. And then Infinita, cool. Fehmida Manzoor and Oroko, my friend from Nigeria, don't tell me. Hina, welcome. So thank you so much for all of you in joining me. So what I'll do is I'm not going to go page by page because that will take forever. But I'll just go into his main crux of his argument, right? And then I hope you'll have some particular questions. And, like my classes, my hope is that before you come to these sessions, you have read the essay, because without reading these essays, the simple, okay, Oroko, I'm sorry, you're from Kenya. I apologize. Okay, so he starts his essay with a question: when exactly does the post-colonial begin? And this is the question that Ella Shohat's essay is entitled, When Was the Post-Colonial, right? And he somewhat states that very facetiously, he says his answer is when the third world intellectuals reach the Metropolitan Academy, which is kind of a funny answer, but there is some truth to it. So that already tells you that the way he is going to argue is, first of all, the privileged location of the third world intellectuals who now call themselves post-colonialists and not necessarily third world intellectuals. And that is a critique of, then further critique of these intellectuals while spewing their solidarity or their terms in against the colonizers within the post-colonial concepts, they themselves inhabiting deeply privileged locations. There is a moment in an essay where he says, in the small town in Pennsylvania where I live, any one of the dominant group who live around me would be very willing to trade places with these subalterns who are getting their high salaries and powerful positions at Princeton, Harvard, and Columbia. So that's a point there. Another critique of post-colonialism is just simply the linguistic obfuscation that he talks about. So he's reading Gyan Prakash's essay within the context of subaltern studies, in which Gyan Prakash tries to argue to redeem post-colonialism. And some of the arguments that he offers is that, it is decentering Western history, right? It is retrieving local histories, then dealing with subjectivities that emerge in colonialism and post-colonialism. All of these are major issues. How are those subjectivities formed? But what Arif Dirlik, who was a really formidable scholar on China and a historian of great repute, and my Facebook friend as well, he passed away a few years ago. But, this is not some, unknown scholar challenging the assumptions of post-colonial studies. So one of the major critiques is the culturalism of post-colonial studies, the emphasis on culture and taking away the more politically acute designation of third world itself. Because what his argument is that when the third world intellectuals wrote and published stuff, they actually lived in the third world, but they had a location, right? Their experience was based on that national experience, and then they never really just did a culturalist reading. They would plot their argument within capitalism as it existed, right? But by putting emphasis on individual subjectivities and how they are created, and by not discussing the rise of capital as it is emerging in those times, what the post-colonial scholars then end up doing is, first of all, they're doing the same things that other people have done before, but they're calling it post-colonialism. And two, that they are not doing systemic study of capitalism itself. So remember, he goes to Emanuel Wallerstein and McLuhan about the system theory, right? The developmental theory of system. I have a video on it. You should watch it. But according to that, there is a teleological movement of capital, right? The second part of the essay is about capitalism itself. Now, remember, at that time in 1994, people weren't using neoliberal capitalism as a designation for the current phase of capitalism. There was Reaganism and Thatcherism, of course. So one of the charges is simply the vocabularies are too culturalist, too post-structuralist, right? And emphasis is on the individual subjects or on the colonial experience, right? Instead of located knowledge from the third world, which has to be political and has to deal with the system of capitalism itself. So deep down then, it is one of the similar critiques of post-colonialism, which basically critique its culturalism, right? And the Eurocentricity of the very scholars who make Eurocentrism their challenge. But what they are saying is that if you take out capital, right, how does Eurocentricity become central to the world politics? Simply by being European or by a larger structure within which it unfolds? And that's where power comes, right? And it's in global capital and the power of that capital that Eurocentrism becomes the central way of looking at the world, right? And what he's arguing is that without reading that power structure, post-colonialists then miss that important part of it, because they are so focused on hybridity, right? And on individual subjects and their engagement with colonialism. So what he insists on is that they should insist on the foundational role of capital in it. But keep in mind that anyone who critiques post-colonialism, they also fall prey to a kind of a straw man argument, okay? Because they make post-colonialism into something that they want to challenge, right? And that's happening pretty clearly over here too. Remember, this field of post-colonial studies in 1994 is not yet fully established. It's still, even its practitioners are trying to define it. Now, if you read Robert Young, we already know that there are post-structuralists in it. There are people like Homi Bhabha who mix post-structuralist discourse, and Lacan and Derrida. There is Gayatri Spivak, who is a Marxist, feminist, deconstructionist, right? There is Edward Said, who predominantly deals with issues of culture. These are the three main names, but then there are people going and reclaiming the precursors, like people like Fanon, right? And then there are people like Robert Young and others who are Marxists, who are retrieving the Marxist tradition, right? So it's not as simple as we are led to believe. Now, also keep in mind, and if you ever read Robert Young's magnum opus on post-colonialism, you will see that he gives us a full account of Marxist tradition and how it is operative within post-colonialism. And now, when in hindsight, when we look at it, there is not even, there are very few post-colonialists who don't deal with issues of neoliberalism or globalization and how it works. There are very few who will not argue that against the forces of neoliberalism, sometimes the nation state itself is the last line of defense, right? But the position is ambivalent. But the critique of hybridity is interesting. Now, remember, there is another major critique of hybridity by Feng Chia, right? In one of his chapters on cosmopolitics. And that is actually a better critique of hybridity because it takes into account the question of who gets to call themselves a hybrid subject. But he also, in the second part of the essay on page 331, and I'll come to the questions in a minute, he talks, the term post-colonial in its various usages carries a multiplicity of meanings that need to be distinguished for analytical purposes. Three uses of the term seem to me to be especially prominent. What are those three uses? One, as a literal description of conditions in formerly colonial societies, in which case the term has concrete reference, right? Like as this is where it happened. B, as a description of a global condition after the period of colonialism, in which case the usage is somewhat more abstract, right? The post-colonial condition, these terms. C, as a description of a discourse on the above-named conditions that is informed by the epistemological and psychic orientations that are products of those conditions, right? What does it do to the people's mind and psyche? So these are the things that he's assigning. Here are these three things that post-colonial studies does. And then what is the role of the intellectuals in that, right? Now, I'm going to stop here because I'm going to insert some of my own ideas in here. But let me see the questions. Okay, so Rosario Swanson, the writer of Cosmopolitics, it's an edited volume, and it's by Bruce Robbins and Feng Chia. You can look it up, and I'll also post a link to the book in the edited version of this essay. And Cosmopolitics is great because it I read it as part of my PhD exams, and I've taught it several times because it kind of encourages us to think nationalism and cosmopolitanism as not as these two competing concepts, but corresponding concepts. And then, the idea is how to think beyond the nation, right? The challenge, though, is when you become post-national or cosmopolitical, that is what capital also wants. It wants to reduce the national powers, right? So where do we reach a compromise where we say we will have some national protections for our own people against the power of multinationals that he mentions? But in our outlook, we will be cosmopolitan in a sense that we will accept our global others as our equals. That's the tension in the concept of nationalism and cosmopolitanism. I also have a recorded and edited version of a webinar that we did a few months ago on this topic, in which these things are discussed, and you can look it up in my playlist on webinars and all that. It's surprising that I've now reached a stage in my career in these online discussions that I can actually point to things that already exist on my channel. All right, so let me go to is there a consensus among historians to regard the whole field as a version of postmodernity? No, there is no such consensus. The beauty of postcolonialism is that it can take different garbs. It can be Marxist, it can be post-structuralist, it can be feminist, right? The only consensus is that post-colonialism deals with the past issues of dominance and hegemony, right? As it does the reading of early capital, it does the rise of industrial capital, and deals with neoliberal capital. None of that is left out. But it depends on where you enter the field. Now, he talks about Spivak here, right? Because the main charge is that these people are too culturalist and they don't take into account the power of the main structure that is underwriting it, that is capital. What does it do, right? Now, those of you who have read Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? I mean, it's a much older essay. She published 10 books after that. But what is her argument in Can the Subaltern Speak, right? If you watch some of my lectures on it, I have not yet recorded the final lecture, but what her argument is, what she's challenging is certain claims that Deleuze and Foucault make in their interview about the workers, right? And one of the claims is that people can speak for themselves, one, and two, they assume a certain universal subject about whom they are speaking, right? And they assume that self-interest or class interest can be universal and global. And that's where she pinpoints them by pointing out that no, interest is connected to the global division of labor, right? And that means the interest of the worker in the West or in France is not the same as the interest of the worker in India or in Bangladesh. We cannot reduce the subject of the post-colonial nation and assume that he or she has the same interest as the subject of Europe, right? That is her challenge, and she cannot make that challenge without invoking a certain kind of Marxism. There is a discussion of class in there, right? So the idea is she's challenging them on that. And then she says, here is the global division of labor, okay? Labor-intensive jobs are going to these places, but they are not creating the conditions that capital set up in the metropolitan cultures, right? And without accounting for them, we cannot posit a universal self-interest of the workers. So that's deeply connected to an understanding of capital as it is rising. There is an understanding of the power of the multinationals and global capital. So to assume that post-colonialists don't really talk about it, we have to then retrieve a kind of post-colonialist who doesn't talk about it, because that knowledge does exist. Okay, there was a, let me go. Is there a concern? Okay, Rosario. There was a defense of cosmopolitan. So I get written by Stuart Hall. What was the post? Yeah, there is a beautiful essay by Stuart Hall. I sadly cannot find a copy of it, otherwise I'll include it in. And that's where he talks about the tension between the hyphen, the post, and the colonial. Now remember, this is a stage where even the concept that whether post-colonial should be one word or there should be a hyphen in between the post is also being discussed. So this is very early stages of post-colonialism. But going back to Dirlik's point, what he's basically saying is that what these post-colonial scholars are doing was already being done by the third world intellectuals. And by giving up on third world as a concept, as a viable concept, and taking post-colonial as an abstract or viable concept, what they have eliminated is the working of capital and its understanding, and the located perspective that came from post-colonialism, right? And he's right in that. And then he also basically says that most of these intellectuals tend to be Indian intellectuals, just like the Chinese intellectuals are reviving a certain kind of Confucianism. The Indian intellectuals are then perpetuating some, which is an extreme reduction also. But here is the deal. If you call it third world study and assign it to third world intellectuals wherever they are, right? The problem there is that you cannot open the field to people here who want to study it, right? Because then you are saying you are not authentic enough because you're located in the West, right? That's the dilemma. Now, by calling it post-colonialism, right, what does it enable us to do, right? My mentor, Robin Goodman, right? She is from where? From Boston, right? She can go and study comparative literature. She can go and learn Spanish, and then she can say, I will do post-colonial scholarship. Not from the top down. I'm a feminist, but I want to go and study Latin America. I want to go and see how women's... So it gives the Western scholars the chance to enter the field and do radical work, right? Now, that's what post-colonialism then opens up, right? It broadens the field, right? And nowhere in any major post-colonial theorist is a total, other than maybe Baba, repudiation of thinking in terms of national histories or national identities. If you bring then into this discussion the African scholars, right, and their debates, Chinua Achebe as a writer, but Chinua Achebe also as a post-colonial critic of Conrad, if his famous speech. Beyond that, you go to the work of Ngugi Thiong'o, Decolonizing the Mind. If you go to Chinwe Zhu and read Decolonizing the African Mind, we incorporate those people into post-colonial scholars, right? And these are the people who critique capitalism, not just global capitalism, but how does it work and create constituencies in the post-colony. After all, when you read Devil on the Cross, right? What is it an indictment of? Of course, the colonial capital, right? Which still pulls the strings of the national elite. That famous scene in the cave, where all these people are saying, this is how that's a satirical scene, but all the idea is this is how I plundered my own people, so I should be given a prize for that. That's a critique of the national elite, but a national elite which is deeply implicated in the project of capital. So by and large, where I agree with him is that maybe third world studies was maybe politically more potent, and that post-colonialism, because of its culturalist emphasis, maybe takes that into account. But if we look at post-colonial studies now, it is so diverse. I mean, it's very hard to even say what we do, right? Because we all have our different approaches. One thing that brings us together is that we either write in solidarity with people from the colonies or people here with whom we can work in solidarity, because you cannot be a post-colonialist if you become a foundational intellectual, if you become a salesperson for capital or salesperson for America. No, that's one thing that you absolutely cannot do, because the field would not permit you to do that. So you at least have to perform an identity that is in solidarity with a silenced group. Okay, good. So Anum, you had a question. Why does he call post-colonialism a version of postmodernism? That's a really good question. Okay, remember, this was written in 1994. And postmodernism as a phenomena wasn't necessarily very highly theorized yet. So what was associated with postmodernism was this idea of decentered subjectivity, of micro narratives in opposition to meta narratives, right? These were some of the tropes, the distinction between high culture and low culture, right? So those are the tropes that he's mobilizing, because he goes into the discussion of post-colonialists talking about micro narratives in opposition to the larger narratives of history, right, or culture. And what he's saying is that then, if you don't account for larger narratives, right, and disparage them, then you also give up accounting for the largest narrative of all that is underwriting the world as it exists, and that is capitalism, right? And so that's why he calls it as a kind of postmodernism. Now, we all know that quite a few aspects of post-colonial theory might be postmodernist in that sense, because we do challenge meta-narratives, we do challenge national narratives, right? And he goes after the Subaltern Studies project, right? What is the main idea behind the Subaltern Studies project? And of course, as always, I'm going to remind you that I do have a whole webinar edited version on it. But the project of Indian Subaltern Studies, it started by people like Pandey and Ranajit Guha, right? These are Marxist scholars, right? And the project was that they believed that the Indian national narrative, which was created by Congress and others, is the narrative of the elite, right, in which the voices of the subaltern classes are actually silenced, right? And so that's what the Subaltern Studies project's aim was, to go and retrieve these silenced knowledges, right, and to record them and juxtapose them against the mainstream national narrative, right? Now, the problem in that is that retrieval is still being done by these bourgeois middle-class intellectuals. So notwithstanding that problem, the project itself then juxtaposes against the normalized national histories retrieved of the people who had been silenced, right? Now, I see it as as an important project, right? But if someone could say, well, when you focus on the minute or micro narratives, you forget an accounting for the main narrative that underwrites even the national cultures, which is capitalism. Maybe it's valid criticism, but I don't see any post-colonialist, even Homi Bhabha, right, who do not take into account the workings of capital, right? Especially now, the moment where we are. So remember, this essay was written in 1994. But these are some of the arguments that people would still employ to convince you that post-colonialism is neither a viable field of study nor worthy of your attention. So that's why I decided to add these to the discussion, so that if you are doing something post-colonial, and if you are an aspiring post-colonial lit scholar, right, first of all, be sure that it doesn't matter what your race and location and ethnicity and gender is. anyone can become a scholar of postcolonialism, but there are certain preconditions. One of them is you must go and learn a language of an oppressed people, whether in your own culture, in the dominant culture, or in the developing world, so that you can have entry into a chunk of knowledge within that. And when you enter that, you don't enter it to appropriate that knowledge. You work in solidarity with the native people. These are some of the conditions. Now, he is also criticizing this assumption by certain scholars that since whole world, 86% of the globe was at one point colonized, that way we can include Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and United States also as post-colonial nations. And there is no distinction between settler colonialism and, the other form of colonialism. And that is a critique of early scholars of post-colonialism, like Bill Ashcroft, Helen Tiffin, right? These were the people who wrote the first texts, right? In 1996 is when Empire Writes Back comes out, right? Now, we already know beyond that those claims that they made in their books, right, have been challenged, have been revised. No one actually considers United States as a post-colonial nation because of its power in the world. But we can go and read what happens to the native tribes, what happens to African Americans, what happens to the minorities in the United States from a post-colonial point of view, right? So those distinctions have already been made. No one reads Australian literature, as post-colonial literature, but if there is a book by an indigenous author in Australia, we will read it as a post-colonial book. Similarly, the question of the diaspora authors, right? Previously, in the third world literature part, because it was connected to the location, we would have had to go and find those authors over there. Now, as long as the diaspora authors are dealing with issues of post-coloniality or what is happening in their former countries or cultures, post-colonialism is open to adding them to the debate as well. So the field has come really far from where Arif Dirlik challenges it, but this is a deeply potent challenge to the culturalism of post-colonial studies, to the elite status of the post-colonial intellectuals, because his argument at the end is that post-colonialism then is a self-presentation by these privileged post-colonial intellectuals themselves, right? And it becomes post-colonialism because they are located in the West, they are at prestigious institutions, and they are the ones who are creating, in the process of becoming the scholars of post-colonialism, the field itself, right? And maybe there is no substance to the field, but 40 years, 30 years later, where I sit or where you all sit, it is still a dynamic field. And this is not the only corner. The Marxists are not the only one who challenge post-colonialism. Remember, everyone feels threatened by it, right? Because the field has this possibility of appropriating any knowledge, any histories in the cause of whatever you want to do, right? And some of our high theorists are too esoteric and, maybe rub the people the wrong way. Okay, so that's where I'm going to stop on this. But so far, this is our second session. We started our whole course with the first session, which was kind of, to me, what is kind of one of the most eloquent description of the field of post-colonial studies by Robert Young. Now, remember, Robert Young is a British guy, right? But we can read him seriously because of his work on Fanon and his work in solidarity with Marxists, with post-colonialists, as a genuine, wonderful post-colonial scholar, right? So his idea, and so that gave us a general idea of what we can consider post-colonial studies. Now, in the next this lecture and a couple of others, we are going into the early critiques of post-colonial studies. And the purpose is to not just buy into whatever the shibboleths of the field are, right? But to know how it is being critiqued, because that allows us to then articulate what we are about as post-colonialists and what is it we do, right? And learning these critiques is important. Okay, let me go to the questions. Infinita. Did I understand well that I need to study a native language from a post? Yes, and that is what Ngugi Chiango will advise you, and so would Spivak. Yeah. Now, if you want to work on South America in general, luckily you can just do it with Spanish, right? Right. But if you want to go and work on a native tribe, let's say in one of the South American countries, your entry into that as a post-colonialist should be then learning their own language. Similarly, like, sometimes people attribute these anecdotes to Gayatri Spivak. Someone asked her, I want to go study in India. And she's like, which part? And they tell her, it's like, do you speak Bengali? Do you speak this? Because her idea is that you cannot enter a subculture within a larger culture without knowing the language. And that's why she is in comparative studies. That's why she gave those lectures, which are called the Welleck Library lectures, which are called The Death of a Discipline, right? About comparative studies, where she insists that other than Eurocentric comparative studies, comparative literature should also develop comparative literature where you can combine Arabic, Hebrew, and English to develop a degree, which quite a few schools do. UT Austin has a wonderful program. But she challenges the Eurocentricity of comparative literature as a field of study. So yeah, I would absolutely encourage anyone from the metropolitan cultures to learn a couple of languages of the people whose works you want to work with. I have another question from Muhammad Uwais. What is the future of subaltern studies as a discipline? I don't know if as a discipline, because then we are talking about universities, but work on subaltern studies. Now, do keep in mind that in regional languages, there is a lot of work on subaltern studies. If you go to Sindh and learn Sindhi and read the works of anyone but the Marxist, right? Sobo Gyan Chandani and all the other people of the Mazdoor Kisan Party, there always has been that work of subaltern studies. If you go to KPK and pull out the works of Bacha Khan and all the ANP writers, you will see that that is actually subaltern studies, right? In Punjab as well. I'm not sure much about Balochistan, but you can find those texts. The question in Pakistan is the possibilities of doing this kind of work. I mean, currently, as I see Pakistan of today, the public sphere is highly restricted and diminished. So, think of it carefully. You cannot write something openly against the religious groups, not because the government won't allow you, but because your life will be threatened. And that's a fact of life. So you can't touch religion, right? So what is the Subaltern Studies project in religion, right? Pick up Fatima Marnisi's book, Women in Islam. It's a rereading of early history of Islam with all the major sources and everything else, right? It's nothing is speculative. She gives you the classical Islamic sources. But what she's attesting and asserting in the final chapter of the book, you could get in trouble in Pakistan for saying those things. So there is not enough room for that kind of work in the field of religion. Then there is not enough freedom to challenge the established institutions, because the moment you do that, right, you get in trouble with them. So the project of subaltern studies then develops vocabularies in poetry and elsewhere where to challenge these powers without naming them. But there is no established university institutes anywhere where this is offered as we are going to do the critique of the nation. In Pakistan these days, even if you critique the nation, you get in trouble. So I don't know. You guys are there. Maybe you know how the situation is. Is there a need for it? Absolutely. Challenging the historical narrative, challenging the religious narrative about rights of minorities, rights of women. Absolutely, there is a need for it. There are some courageous people in the public domain who are doing that, right, at a great risk to their own lives, right? But I don't. I don't think so. I've seen it as an established subfield in any of the universities. Good. Not just that, because the problem is if you just go and study a native culture or any other culture, um, the better access to it would be to know the language. But also, it's also kind of we, you, me, and others entering a culture with a certain degree of humility by admitting that just as Masood Raja cannot come to University of North Texas and say, I've read all literature in Urdu translation, give me a job. And that comes from Ngugi Chiango's challenge to this whole inequality, that there are people in America who can claim to be scholars on Africa without knowing a single language. But if an African tries to come to America and says, I've studied everything about America in Yoruba, no one will take him seriously. That is the global inequality. I once had a colleague at a former institution where I worked who was considered a leading scholar on Mossadegh and on pre-Shah Iran. She had published a book with Cambridge University, right? And when someone introduced me to her, I was like, Ahwale Shoma, right? Chetori. And she's like, I don't speak Farsi. And I was really, really dumbfounded, because if someone tells you I'm an Iran scholar, the first thing you will assume is you know Farsi, right? Because how would you study texts, Iranian texts, literary or historical, without having access to that language? And how can you become a scholar simply by reading works in translation? So that's why, yes, Infinita, I think acquiring native level skills in at least one language of the region that you want to work with and learn about, I think would do wonders for any person. I have a student, brilliant, and she has a wonderful job now. And she came to study with me, and she's like, can I do post-colonial studies? And I was like, which language, which area do you want to work in? And she's like, well, I want to work on Palestine, Israel. And I was like, do you speak Hebrew? And she's like, yeah. I was like, can you pick up Arabic? And she's like, yes, give me a year. So in 1 year, she went and learned classical Arabic, and she already knew Hebrew. And that's why she went and wrote a wonderful dissertation, because she could read the Arab novels in Arabic if they were not available in English, and she could read the Hebrew novels, and that made her into a formidable scholar. I mean, she herself was Jewish, right? But other than her own identity, what made her into a better scholar was that she had grasp of two languages within a contested nation state where those two constituencies are trying to represent each other, right? And that's brilliant work, right? Rosario, is there a danger to reproduce the colonial impetus because the subaltern intellectual masters theory, whereas the sub-subaltern in the nation does not access? Yes, the only time it would happen is when, and I don't consider the intellectuals stationed at the universities in Canada and United States, people like me, we are not subalterns, right? We are privileged middle-class bourgeois people. So if anyone says I'm a subaltern, I disagree with that, because we have positions of power, right? We may not have immediate power, but we have access to resources, we have a political voice, we have a platform. I think the only time the problem will be when, let's say, Masood Raja becomes a scholar. I mean, I don't consider myself a scholar, but where then I take this knowledge and go to Pakistan, my native country, and start saying, well, you guys don't know how to do things. I'm from America. This is how we do things here. That is an imperial attitude. But if I take my knowledge, whatever I know, and go back to Pakistan to visit or to give a lecture, right? And I do that with a certain degree of humility by saying, this is what I know. This is of this culture that I use and I have learned and I have appropriated. I mix it with this knowledge from the West, right? In the process, I am introducing somewhat the tropes and philosophies from my own culture into this mainstream discourse, right? My hope is that eventually, if I infuse that mainstream discourse with the knowledge of my own local culture, eventually it will alter that. That is what hybridity is. And at the same time, I'm bringing this knowledge from there. Can you use it and tweak it and change it so that it becomes useful to you? The only problem is when I offer this knowledge to people in Pakistan or in my own hometown as the only true knowledge. Now, that's an imperial act. So that would be a point, right? And that's why I always encourage my students that any field of study that you enter, learn its discourses, learn how it does things, right? But also question it, challenge it. That's why we are talking about Arif Dirlik today, because I don't just want to tell people here is post-colonialism, it's great. No, I want them to know what are the challenges to it so that one, they know institutionally, academically, what challenges have been posed to that field of study, but also those challenges then make us aware of what not to do, right? What not to assume as scholars and as students of post-colonial studies. And that is crucial to enter the field with a certain degree of humility and to constantly be willing to change it, right? And change our own attitudes. Questions. Now, remember, we will meet next Saturday as well, and we will discuss Ian McClintock's essay, and it is available on the course website. Now, do keep in mind that I will post the link to the course website in the description to the edited version of today's session. But it's very easy. You go to postcolonial.net and you click on postcolonial courses, and there you are. You know, your course is listed at the top, and the links to download the files are right there. So that's all I have today. Sorry for the brief interruption, but I'm so glad that we were able to get back on. So that's where I'll leave it, and I'll pause a little for any more questions and comments. And if not, do let me know what you think. And if you have any queries or questions, send them my way. So, Anam, I don't have a question, but I was wondering if you could give a small lecture on location of culture by Baba. Now, you might have noticed on my YouTube channel, I have intentionally avoided Baba. When I did one lecture on mimicry, but I have not yet recorded a lecture on hybridity. And I don't even feel ready to discuss location of culture. First of all, I have to reread it. But then Location of Culture is a book that requires further deep reading, right? I will probably encounter it in the year or so when I feel confident. But to be very honest, at this moment, if I just picked up the book and started discussing it, I will not feel confident, and I don't want to do more damage than the book can do itself. Okay, so can you explain the interface between modernity and tradition? Yes, maybe at some stage. I do have a lecture on how T.S. Eliot does it, you know, his question with tradition and the role of the individual poet. Just look for my lectures on theory, and that kind of discusses it. Nida. To what extent subaltern epistemology has ontological impacts for the betterment of subjugated group? I don't know. I mean, knowing something, like what is epistemology? Knowing how we know, right? So if we don't produce any knowledge, whether by the subalterns themselves or in solidarity with them, right, then how will we know, right? How can we make an ontological difference in their lives, or they themselves can make an ontological difference in their life if they are not represented politically, as Spivak would say, and represented in text? The question is, do we appropriate their voice and speak for them, which would be terrible, or do we speak in solidarity with the subaltern group, learn from them, and then try to represent it? Because then it enters the field of knowledge and the public sphere and the field and the political debate, and maybe we can ask for some change. I mean, think of it, the Dalit problem in India. One way it is to just assign it to this is how India is. The other is that the Dalit activists constantly keep fighting against injustices, right? And what do they have? They have their text. Where do you go? To early struggles, you go to the Annihilation of Caste. Who wrote it, right? B.R. Ambedkar, right? So if you go to Ambedkar and you read Annihilation of Caste, then you have a text written by a Dalit scholar who's basically saying, here is how we need to destroy caste, right? There is a text. That text can bring ontological changes. Who wrote the Indian Constitution? Ambedkar, right? There were parts in that constitution that only someone who had experienced that kind of life could have written, right? So, yes, absolutely it can make a difference, right? Knowledge is always intimately connected to issues of power. The question of post-coloniality or subaltern voices is to constantly keep producing more knowledge, more political awareness, but not from top down, right? Working in solidarity with people whom you're trying to represent. Now remember, when Spivak writes, can the subaltern speak, right? That's why the last sentence is third world intellectual, what is it? There is no use of global laundry list. The third world intellectual cannot dismiss representation with a flourish, because the argument there is, do we have a responsibility to represent our subaltern others? Or can we just assume that subalterns can speak for themselves? Because if we assume that, then the intellectual has abdicated his or her role, right? Now, coming from that, yes, absolutely, we must produce knowledge. We must expose things happening in subaltern cultures or being done to them, but not as those who understand the subaltern better than the subaltern, but in solidarity with them, right? And I think that's the subtle difference we need to make. Okay, I think, let me see if there are, cool. So that's where we are. I'm going to stop here and call it a day. And then please stay tuned. I will have the edited version of this available in the playlist that is listed as Postcolonialism course. And then next week, I hope that you all will join us for a discussion of the Ian McClintock essay, which is available on the course website. So that's all I have. Thank you so much for joining me. And as always, peace and love.